I want to officially welcome you to the webinar today, Birds, Feeders, and Science. Oh my, what can we discover together? My name is Rachel Mady, and I am the BirdCams Lab project leader, and I am going to be kind of leading us through the webinar today and keeping us on track. I want to give a warm welcome to everyone that's here and also to everyone that's watching the archive recording, because I know many of you couldn't be here today, but we are still so thrilled to have you be a part of this community. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Ben to introduce himself.
Hi, everybody. My name is Ben Walters. I work with the Cornell Labs BirdCams program as the communication specialist. I've been working with the cam since 2016 now, I think, and it's been really fun. I get to interact with everybody through, communicating via social media, making content, cutting highlight clips. You might have talked to me over email if you email BirdCams about anything. Also, I came from a research background studying predator-prey dynamics at the University of Western Ontario, where I did my master's, and I'm happy to be here today talking with everybody about the Cornell Lab FeederWatch cam and this upcoming investigation.
I guess I'm the third person here. Yeah.
Go ahead, Charles.
My name's Charles Eldermeyer. I'm the BirdCams project leader at the Lab of Ornithology, and I've been actually working at the lab since 2005. Made it over 15 years, but since 2012, I've been focused completely on bird cams. And as many of you know, and some of you probably don't know, which is one of the things you're going to find out about, is for the last couple of years, bird cams has also been, involved in this other project that we're calling BirdCams Lab that Rachel's going to give you some more information on. But it's been a really great way to interact with the community in a way that we never had before. So really excited to be here. I'll be keeping an eye on the Q&A and the chat. If you all start typing again at the same time, I can't read it all, but I promise I'll try. And if you're asking questions, just a reminder, throw them in the Q&A because they queue up for us and we won't miss them. They don't go away like the chat does when it scrolls up really fast. But I will also be looking in the chat and replying when necessary. So hand things back over to Rachel. Really happy to be here today.
Thanks, Charles. And yeah, I'm definitely the newer one of the BirdCams team. So I've only been here for 3 years or so, and I was first a graduate student, and now I'm thankful to be part of the BirdCams Lab team. So we're going to keep doing BirdCams Lab stuff as long as we can. So with that, I'm going to share my screen with everyone again, because I want to orient you to the rest of this hour. And if you ever see me turn to the side, I'm keeping track with my notes because I want to make sure we cover everything that we hope to today. And we're first going to just give a brief overview of what BirdCams Lab is. Many of you may be familiar with BirdCams, but maybe not as much as BirdCams Lab. We probably have some newer people in today. And then I want to dive into the specific investigation that we're focusing in on, which is a part of BirdCams Lab, and that's called Cornell Feeders Live. Then I'm going to talk about the highlights from discussions we've been having on the Wonder Board. And if you don't know what the Wonder Board is, you will soon. And then we're going to open up the last half hour or so for a discussion. So that's when we're going to answer your questions in the Q&A, and we're going to be addressing what you're bringing up in the chat. So with that, BirdCams Lab. So BirdCams Lab is a part of BirdCams, and we initially created BirdCams Lab here at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology because we saw people watching the BirdCams, asking questions, collecting data, and we realized there needed to be a space for this curiosity and this ambition to collect data with the cams to take place. And we wanted to give people the opportunity to work with scientists, to co-create together investigations on the cams. And so what we did was we created BirdCams Lab, which you can see here in a screenshot of the website, and that allows people to jump into any part of the scientific process that they want to. So people can come into, like you, tuning in today or watching the archive recording, you can observe and ask questions with us, help us figure out what questions we want to answer, collect the data, and then go through the rest of the process. You can jump in at the analyze and visualize stage of the data we collected, or help us share it out with the rest of the community. And all of these parts are important, but you can jump in and out based on your interests. And one of the biggest tenets of BirdCam's lab is that you can come to this space with no prior knowledge, no prior experience of birds or science, but we work together and we learn together. And we have created supports to help you and us get through this process together and make discoveries on the cams. For now, so BirdCam's lab, we work through each of these steps in the scientific process for each investigation. And right now for Cornell Feeders Live, we are in the observe and question phase. So we're starting here, and next is data collection. But before we can collect data, we have to figure out what question we're going to ask. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the hour. But for many of you who may be familiar with the Cornell FeederWatch cam, this is what you see. And for those of you who may not be familiar, it's a cam that's located at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And before I turn it over to Ben to kind of orient us to this cam, I want to put out a poll to see how many of you, how often you watch this cam. So a poll should come up on your screen now. And so how often do you watch this cam? Do you watch it daily? Have you never watched it? And Charles and Ben, you are able to vote this time if you would like to. Previously on webinars, only people tuning in could vote, but I have allowed it so we all can vote. And you guys are quick. I see in the chat that Mark, it looks like you watch it a few times a week. Yes, that is also, that's not an option, but good to know. I'll let a couple more people put in their votes before I end the poll. All right. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. It's okay if you didn't put in your vote, no worries, but I want to keep us moving along. I'll share out the results so you all can see what I'm seeing. And it looks like we have everyone here, people who watch it multiple times a day, to you have never watched a cam before, but you are here. And we are so happy that you are. And so welcome everyone. And to make sure we are all on that same page, I'm going to stop sharing those results and I'm going to turn it over to Ben so that he can kind of orient us to what this cam is, where it is, and what we should know.
Sure, thanks, Rachel. So just like Rachel mentioned, the Cornell FeederWatch cam is aptly named because it's located right next to the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. It's actually located in a bird feeding garden that's also sort of an observation garden for people that are visiting the lab's visitor center. So as you can see in the picture, there is a pond in the background. It's a very beautiful scene. We have about a 10-acre pond, and surrounding that pond is what's called Sapsucker Woods. It's a little bird sanctuary area that attracts all sorts of forest residents. And many of them come by our bird feeders, many of the birds. It's a really beautiful camera. We just recently installed a couple years ago a 4K cam. So we get crystal clear images of the birds as they arrive at the feeder and forage on the various offerings that we provide. One thing we try to do is offer a pretty diverse set of both feeders and food types to attract a lot of different species of birds. As you may know, some species or some food types and some feeders accommodate all sorts of birds, whereas others are more specialized to attract certain types of birds. So we try to offer a mix of those to get, woodpeckers, anything from, goldfinches. We have cardinals, as you can see in the picture, but really all sorts of birds. We even get some fun migrants stopping by come spring, like Baltimore Orioles. They come by and feed on the oranges that we offer. So it's a really great cam. It's also a really great opportunity to be able to learn more about the birds that we see through an investigation. And I'm really excited to see what type of things people are interested in, sort of learning about the birds that are visiting this feeder, because we have a lot of people watching and a lot of people asking questions all the time, and now's our chance to actually do a little bit of a deeper dive into the birds that we watch every day. So it's a really fun opportunity.
Thanks for that, Ben. So that's the CAM, and many of you may already be familiar with the investigation title, but we have called the investigation with this CAM Cornell Feeders Live. And you may be wondering why we called it that, and that's because we're going to be collecting data live in real time, and we'll be able to watch the CAM and collect data on the side, and it'll look something like this. This is the data tool that we used for a previous investigation with Panama Live. And you can see that the view of the CAM is right here, and we're going to be able to click buttons here on the right-hand side to collect data from this CAM. And so we decided to call it Cornell Feeders Live. But before we can collect data, like I said, in this investigation, we're at the observe and question asking phase. And so right here, you see a screenshot of what the Wonder Board looks like. And this is on our BirdCamps Lab website right now. And people have come to this Wonder Board forum and have posted down here in the join discussion and have posted their thoughts, questions, and we've started to narrow in on what we can actually investigate on this CAM. You can see the CAM in the top right-hand corner, so you can observe and ask questions just about the same time, which is how some of the best research questions are asked, is when you watch things and you think about what you are curious and want to know more about. And so the conversations on this Wonder Board for the past, we've done it for about a week now. It's been live, and we've had more than 30 people post, and we've had many more vote where they can actually vote on the ones and upvote them so that the ones that are more favored rise to the top. And we have run the gamut in terms of what people are interested in learning more about. But I do want to share with everyone today the 4 big buckets that appeared through all the question asking and wondering aloud. The first being arrival patterns, where many people posted on the Wonder Board and are interested. You may be interested tuning in today, wondering about how birds are arriving at the feeder and whether there's some sort of schedule. And this is actually the #1 topic in terms of what people were most interested in voting on and on the Wonder Board. Next, we have weather effects. So that also runs the gamut in terms of what is weather, because weather, depending on where you are in the world, could be anything from a lot of snow to a lot of rain and anything in between. And there's been a lot of great discussion on what we mean when we say weather and thinking about how those different factors can relate to what's going on the feeder. And then we have this idea of food preference. Like Ben said, there are a lot of different food types that we put on the feeder, and we do have the ability to manipulate them and to actually be pretty intentional with how we put the food out. And we could maybe dig into how different species prefer different types of food on the feeder as well. And then one that always seems to come up in almost all the investigations we've done with feeders, it's people have brought up, or we've actually investigated interactions. And there's been some interest as well in this investigation in the question asking phase that we're in right now, in understanding the frequency of interactions. And does that change throughout the day? Do interactions between birds change in response to weather, in response to the food? And so that's another area of interest from people on the Wonder Board. And there are all possibilities for an actual investigation here, and something we've started to talk about on the Wonder Board, and we can talk more about today, is that these topics are all pretty feasible, but then when we start narrowing in on how we actually investigate it, we start to have to think about what we mean by the words we're using and how we're actually going to collect the data when we have the tool that we do, which is clicking buttons while we watch the cam. And I am curious, before we get into a discussion, I am noticing I am coming through scratchy, and I apologize to all. This is the first time I've worn a scarf for a webinar. And so I'm going to take off that scarf. And maybe the feedback will go away. If it doesn't, then please let me know. So hopefully I'm coming through clear. And before we get into a discussion about these themes and topics and about what's coming to mind for you all, I want to launch a second poll. And I want to actually see how many of you have participated on this Wonder Board in this investigation so far, just to get a sense of who is here today. All right, looks like we got about 93% of you have voted, so I'll end the poll. No worries if you didn't have a chance to vote. And it looks like we have everyone here again too. We have many of you here today have participated on the Wonder Board. Many of you have not, and many of you aren't quite sure, which is completely fine because the way the world is right now, sometimes it can be hard to keep track of things. So no worries. But this is BirdCam's lab where we welcome everyone to come participate at any point. And so we're so glad that you're here today. And we invite you to ask questions in the Q&A and to share your thoughts in the chat. And so I'll stop sharing those results and I will open the floor. So Charles, if there's anyone asking questions in the Q&A, or we can maybe touch on some of the questions that were submitted ahead of time, we can start digging into some of these themes or some other thoughts that are coming from the community.
Yeah, that's great. I think that everyone's been doing a good job of listening and jotting a few things here. And in the background, I've just answered some questions about technical things about the camera. Since it's not really a technical webinar, we didn't really plan to answer. Feel free to keep asking them. If you're interested in those more technical questions, just email us at birdcams@cornell.edu. And we have a whole email that kind of walks through the general way that we do cameras. That'll be way more interesting to read than to hear me recite to you. It's pretty dry stuff. There are actually a couple questions that focus on BirdCam's lab that have flowed into the Q&A. And one of the questions, well, two of them actually are focused on what does arrival even mean? What's an arrival pattern? Does arrival mean how they arrive? Okay, so we have one person saying, Stephen, what's an arrival pattern? But then Martha, does arrive mean how they arrive, or rather when they arrive, like time of day, presence of other birds, etc. So maybe you might want to just take a moment to either touch on what those broad, maybe an example or two from each of those categories, but starting with arrival.
Definitely. Thank you for those wonderful questions. That's what I'm talking about when we start with somewhere and then we kind of narrow in on exactly what we mean. And I'll just share some. So I said arrival patterns. You pointed out arrival. What does that mean? Some of the questions that people have been posting in the Wonder Board fall under some of these that I've summarized here on my other screen. So I'll share some of those. So have many people wonder about which species arrive the earliest. So when they say arrive, it's land on the feeder. So when you're watching the feeder, who's the first one there? And then at the end of the day, who's the last one there? There's been quite a few people, and I think a teacher also commented on the Wonder Board. Her classroom is interested in knowing the answer to that question. And then there's also people who have wondered about visitation patterns to the feeder throughout the day. And so for a particular species, they're curious, when do you see them land on the feeder and how does that go through the day? And we can talk about what we mean by land on the feeder. Do we mean on any of the feeders in view? Do we mean on the platform? And that would be something we want to talk about and make sure is clear in whatever data protocol we decide on. And then there's also been people who just want to know when the feeder is the busiest. So they don't really care exactly like what one species is doing, but they're just like, when in the day are there a ton of species? And completely understand that, because when you come to watch the feeder, you want to see birds. So it'd be really interesting to know when to hone in on in terms of visitation. So in previous investigations, we've narrowed down arrival as literally a bird landing on the feeder before. But that's something to talk about. That's definitely not something we have to do. It could be bird coming in view of the feeder, because we've done that before. So great questions.
And there's also a bunch of people hopping in right now to say, wait, where is the Wonder Board? So I just put the link in the chat along with a link to sign up for this investigation. and just a link to the general BirdCams Lab website. But an interesting thing, so just look for those in your chat, folks, rather than me reading the HTTP and so on to you. One question that I think is interesting, that is worth spending a moment or two on. Alicia says, I'm a little nervous about doing a live study because I'm afraid I might miss something. And she also asks, is the study limited to 6 bird types?
Yeah, I can sort of touch on that one. That's a great question. First off, we don't want anybody to be nervous about participating. Even though it is in a live environment, the idea is that during the data collection process, we're hoping to have multiple people watching the cam at any point in time, right? So if by chance you do, there's a lot of birds arriving, or, for depending on what we're collecting data on, if a lot of stuff is happening, if you miss something, that's okay, because we've got other people hopefully that are going to be there also collecting data, and we can collate all of that data together and figure out, based on the observations of multiple people observing the same time period, we get a better idea of what's actually happening on the feeder during that time, versus if it's just a single person going through and trying to identify every bird that's hopping on the feeder if there's a ton of action going on. So that's the idea. It's a crowdsourced type of data collection where we're not relying on any single one person to do all the heavy lifting. That's the great part about it, as this BirdCams Lab community, is that we rely on each other to not only come up with the questions, but also collect the data together. And onto the second part of the question, are we limited to 6 types of birds? Not necessarily limited to 6 types of birds, but we are limited with the amount of buttons that we have on the data collection window. So Rachel showed an image of an example of sort of what live data collection looks like. And there was 6 buttons of different bird species, as well as a couple extra buttons that also allowed us to tag other types of information. Now, the information doesn't have to be a species in particular. It could be, a seed type. It could be, just a general characteristic of a species, like a large bird, medium-sized bird, small bird. It depends on what our question is that we're asking. And then we can decide what buttons to best use to answer that question. So, if anybody else wants to add anything, but that's typically what we're looking at. And it's an important thing to remember when we're thinking about the things that are actually plausible to investigate, right? Because we are limited to these, 6 to 8 number of buttons in order to collect data with. So it's harder to do more sort of involved data collection where we're collecting a lot of different types of information, because we are collecting data live, number one, and we have a limitation on the number of buttons.
So surprisingly, as you're talking, even more questions rolled in, and lots of some good things in the chat too. So just a reminder to anybody who might be coming in new, if you have questions, try and stick them into the Q&A box rather than the chat, just because the chat can sometimes move them out of view. And it's likely we're going to get more questions than we'll be able to answer. So if we don't get to your question, it's not because we don't like your question or we don't like you. It's just there's only so much time. But there's a few different, we're going to try and get through these kind of thematically. Okay. And a few people are asking about how long data collection will last and when it will be. And so maybe we'll jump into there and then talk a little bit about how I have a few questions sort of about how we support the investigation as it goes. So how long is this investigation actually happening for?
Great question. So we are hoping to do this investigation in the beginning weeks of March. That's when we're aiming to collect the data. So after we decide on what data we'll collect, we'll need some time to actually make the buttons look like the data we want to collect and make sure everything's hooked up on the back end. And so we're hoping to do it for a couple weeks in March, because of the timeline that we're hoping for the whole investigation, because while we love doing this, and while we wish we could do research projects for as long as we want, we have a timeline we're trying to adhere to because we're funded by a National Science Foundation grant. And so the timeline we've planned out for allows for data collection for about 2 weeks or so in March. And so that will be the time where we watch it live and we click the buttons to collect the data. And when it starts is probably going to shift around a bit depending on the back end of making sure all the buttons look like the way we want them to, and the supports like a field guide or a tutorial are all laid out for everyone. So that's what we're hoping for.
Great. And so we have sort of how long we're shooting for. Now, what's the deal with voting? We had a question early on that we were talking about the questions, and the question was, how do we vote on the Wonder Board? And maybe if you wanted to spend just a moment kind of clarifying the process we're in right now and voting in general.
That is a great question. So there's kind of 2 different types of voting that has happened in previous investigations. And so the first one is upvoting. And so when you're on the Wonder Board, when you're using the discuss tool, which is a tool we've embedded into that web page so that we can talk to each other, there's a little caret underneath someone's comment on that board, and you can click that, and that allows you to upvote something. And then there's a way to, on the board, to filter based on best, and then you can filter to see the ones that have the most upvotes. And so I can actually, I can actually show everyone what I mean by that, because I think many of you today are not familiar with the Wonder Board, which is completely fine. So let me, so I'm just talking in the abstract, share my screen so you all can see exactly what I mean. Okay. So I'm going to share the Wonder Board with you all. Is that coming through okay? Okay, so this is the Wonder Board. And if you go down here, and I'll zoom in a little bit, you can join the discussion by typing in here once you have an account. And then if I like something that someone says, if I liked what Alicia says, I can click on this arrow and I can upvote it. And then if I want to see the board in terms of what other people have upvoted, I can sort it by best. And then that's how things kind of rise in the conversation. And so this one had 14, so it rose to the top. And that's the first type of voting. The second type of voting has to do with actually selecting the research question. And so that's when we use a different tool and we ask everyone to vote, and we actually select the research question or the topic, depending on where we are, and narrowing that down. And that's when we start to make the decisions about data collection. So in previous investigations, people have voted on the question itself, on which species we're going to collect data on the topic that they're most interested in terms of like extra data to collect, to do a sub question. So those are the 2 different layers of voting that you can participate in.
Perfect. People are very inquisitive today. It's great. And thank you everyone out there for asking questions. And there are a lot of them. So I think one sort of a general category of question that we're getting from a lot of different people involves the idea that, gosh, if there's a bunch of people taking data at the same time, how do you tell what's going on? So can you analyze it to avoid multiple sightings of the same bird? Is there a minimum time, or do I have to sign up for a shift? Maybe one of you could address kind of sort of the philosophy behind this, and then we'll back into the question after you're done of why is it important to do this live? So keep that in the back of your head.
And do you want to start, or I can start?
Sure. I mean, I can start, and then I might kick it over to you in terms of how we analyze sort of all the raw data that's coming in. So number one, you don't have to sign up for shifts. There's no sort of minimal obligation that anybody has in terms of if they want to participate. It can be for, they can share their observations from a minute of the camera during our data collection period, or they can watch for hours at a time and share what they see. So there's no minimum or maximum obligation that anyone has to uphold in order to be a participant. And like I said before, you don't have to worry about actually catching every single little thing that you see on camera. It's great if you do, but don't feel like you haven't done a good job if you missed that one cardinal that came at the feeder, or you didn't see what species it was that stopped by the sunflower seeds. Because the idea is that we have a bunch of people watching at one time, and by having that crowd watching and all taking data, we can sort of hone in on the story that's being told at the feeder during that time through everyone's observations. And I'll kick it back over to you, Rachel, to share a little bit about how the data, once we pull the data, how that works.
Yeah, so pulling the data is actually really exciting because this is something new, and it's not something that anyone has really dealt with before. Is like, what do you do with data collected in a live environment by multiple people? And so this has been something that we didn't expect to be something that was an interesting challenge, but became one. And so far, what we've done is we collapse people's observations to, depending on the question, and depending on the biology of the birds, and depending on what data we're collecting, it will shift this little window. But the window of 1 minute is something we've used for some previous investigations, where if people say that something happened within 1 minute of each other, it's the same observation. And when we're thinking about birds being present on a feeder, it seems like that mirrors what's actually happening. But because what happens is you have kind of these little peaks in observations, and sometimes there's one person watching, many times there's like 2 people watching. And so it's interesting to see when they agree with each other or don't agree with each other, and there's still room to explore in that area. So we've come up with what we think is the best practice for using it for BirdCam's lab, but there's definitely room to grow and definitely things to think about in terms of honing in on the best way to do it. But it's very interesting. And in terms of why you would collect data live, there are live cams all over the world, and there are things that are happening on those cams that people are picking up on, and it's an opportunity to really kind of tap into something that's already going on and engaging everyone that's already watching. And so that's the reason why we tried to surface BirdCam's lab and give the opportunity for this live data collection.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
go ahead. Sorry, Charles, I just wanted to add one thing about the live environment. Like the draw of watching something live is something that you don't get when you're watching something that's pre-recorded, right? If you're watching a live sporting event, it's not the same as if you're watching a replay of the Super Bowl that happened, right? And that's what we see. We see thousands and thousands and thousands of people are watching live cameras, and that provides an opportunity to collect data about birds, about anything really, but in our case about birds. And so having tools available for people to easily collect data while they're watching, if that's something they're interested in, is could be a huge resource to learn more about all of these species, about all the things that people are passively watching at the moment, but they could be collecting data. And so developing those tools is a really important thing to get off the ground.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on that and to answer a question, a couple different versions of this question have come up in the Q&A tool. And Nancy wrote, how can you get accurate data if there are gaps in observations? And this is something that I hear a lot from people, because especially from people who aren't necessarily scientists or haven't had to go gather data to try and solve a puzzle, especially in the biological world. And most of what we know about the world, there are giant gaps. And what we do is we take lots of samples of something and then use those samples to try and figure out what reality is telling us, right? So it's kind of like the model I like to think of in my head is a dot-to-dot picture. So each one of our samples is a little dot on a page. And the more dots you get, the more richness, whatever it is that is illustrating, it sort of like illustrates, right? So the cool thing about live cams or recordings of live cams is that we have like every moment on that camera, right? But we don't need every moment on that camera to actually approximate reality, all right? So while censusing what's happening there is a neat goal. It's not actually the goal of data collection to get every single instance, but it's rather to in part encourage people to participate, because it's not just us learning from the data you're collecting, you're learning from collecting data, right? It's a two-way street that we're hoping for through this project. So that's my little that's my rant on sampling, which I really enjoy giving. You can ask these two. They've probably heard me give it a long time ago and recently, but we've had a couple of people actually ask about Zooniverse and whether or not they need a Zooniverse login, or they just came from Zooniverse, and does the tool work the same way? And I wonder if you might just do a short brief for the people that don't know what Zooniverse is, up to, is this the same thing? Do they need a Zooniverse ID to do this?
Welcome everyone from Zooniverse. I'm so glad that you are with us today. Great questions, and especially because we just finished collecting data for an investigation on Zooniverse, very relevant. This tool and this investigation is different than Zooniverse. So what we did for the last investigation, some of you may be familiar, was battling birds, and we collected data on archived video clips. And this data collection, we needed to have a place where we could document some detailed information about each clip. And so this one, we are going to be live, and this is going to be on our BirdCam's website. And so this one will be separate from Zooniverse, and we're not going to use Zooniverse as the tool, but we have for past investigations, and we could always go back to Zooniverse if in the future it makes sense to collect data there. But for this one, we're going to be right where we have been before with BirdCams and collect data live over on our platform. So you don't need to create a Zooniverse login. The only login you need to create to participate on the Wonder Board is a discuss. So you can see all the comments on there, but you can't actually post or interact unless you create a login. It's free. And then for data collection, we will ask you to create what's called a CAST login, and that has to do with the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And there are resources that walk you through how to do that, and that's also free as well.
So one thing that several people have asked about is actually, wait a second, I don't actually know the birds that well at your feeder. Do you guys have any resources? How can I learn? Where can I learn? How am I going to be able to know that I'm doing a good job of data collection? I don't know, Ben, if you want to talk at all about what we have available for them.
Sure, yeah. So one thing that the Cornell Lab has is a ton of online resources. Not only will we probably provide some sort of tutorial to help you get associated with the things we're looking forward to collecting in this project. So we'll have something there specific to the question we eventually decide on that will help lead you through the type of data we're looking towards collecting. But if there's a bird, for example, that you don't know, on our website, our CAM site, allaboutbirds.org/cams, if you navigate to any of one of our feeder cam pages, at the bottom of the page, there'll be a species info tab. And that species info tab will contain a picture of every single species that we've actually seen visit that feeder up to this point that we're aware of. The cam goes live 24/7, so there might have been a one-off rare species that's visited that might have slipped through the cracks, but all that we're aware of. And so you can click on those birds to direct you to resources on our online field guides or through eBird that can give you all sorts of information about how to ID these birds, give you a little bit more information on their natural history, their range. You could go as deep as you want to.
So a couple of questions that actually focus on what we hope to learn from doing this. What do we what's interesting about it in terms of what a community might find, and is this something we're going to publish in a peer-reviewed journal? So sort of like importance of the research, interestingness of the research. Maybe you could touch on those themes.
Yeah, great questions. And something that we should always be thinking about when we take on research is what's the point? And it's usually the question we get is also, what's the point? So there's kind of two sides of a coin for BirdCam's lab. One side is the actual research we're doing with the cams. And we do hope to actually answer a question that's interesting and that is relevant and that we can share out with the scientific community. And that's part of the way we encourage our community to walk through and choose which question we do. So for instance, weather is really, really interesting, but there has been quite a bit of research about it in terms of the effects of temperature and in terms of the effects of wind. So maybe if we do weather, we don't focus on those variables and we focus on a different one. Or maybe we focus on arrival patterns for species that we don't know a lot about. And so that's kind of figuring out what's interesting in terms of previous research. In terms of this, we are using this on one cam. And so in terms of publishable, sometimes what we do can influence the next study after us. And so for instance, we did a study with hawk happenings where we learned something really cool about the behavior of the birds on the cam, but we did realize that it's one cam, it's one family over one season. And so it's kind of a starting point, the pilot study, as some would call, for scientific research. If anyone out there has ever done any research, they may be familiar with the idea of a pilot study where you try things out and you see what works, and then you go to the next step where you kind of expand it. And so that's what this investigation could do. So that's in terms of the biological side, which is pretty exciting. The other side has to do with BirdCam's lab as a whole. And so we started this project because we wanted to try out this idea of co-creation, where we all work together, professional and non-professional scientists work together to create something and go through the whole scientific process together. And at the end of the day, how does that affect what we learn in terms of about science and knowledge? And so there's this overarching goal of BirdCam's lab as well, because we're funded by the National Science Foundation, to understand informal learning in everyone that's a part of this. So there's kind of two sides of the research coin. And we do hope to share that with the community, both in potentially published scientifically peer-reviewed papers, as well as other mediums as well. So social media, posts online, and other ways that we can disseminate the information.
Those are all good points, and it brings, I think, a couple of people back to the question. So I had a nice little conversation in the Q&A with Nancy about, like, wait, if you're not sampling all the time, what about the question? You know, like, if nobody's taking data at sunset because nobody's watching the camera and your question's about sunset, and it raises a valid point. How do we get to that question? And somebody else asked about voting again for the question. I thought it might be worth bringing up again. Maybe how do we get to the point where the community has a question that their data collection efforts will then be focused on?
Sure, I can take a first stab at that, and Rachel, you can add anything if you want. So that's a really good question. So we're talking about this investigation, we're talking about the Wonder Board, but how do we get from what we're talking about on the Wonder Board to actually finding out what we agree upon in terms of what we're honing in on for this next live investigation on the Cornell Feeders? So first, we definitely invite all of you to continue the discussion on the Wonder Board, because that's where it all starts. We've already outlined some of the main, interesting topics that have come up in the community so far, and we're excited to continue to talk about those and how we might, number one, if they're feasible given the tools we have, and number two, how we might refine a question into something that we can actually start collecting data on with the live tools. So once the conversation continues on the Wonder Board and we start to get these like themes that are popping up that we see are sort of the main interest, what we'll do is we'll start honing in on those themes a little bit more into something that's more testable, and then we'll allow the community to vote on those various themes. So we'll send out an email to the community telling you it's time to vote on the next question for the Cornell live investigation. And you'll have your opportunity to, put in your 2 cents on which question you're most interested in investigating next on the feeders. So once that happens, once we have our question in hand, we'll build out the tool for the live investigation. We'll get all of our buttons ready, and then we'll be in communication with you to eventually start the data collection process.
Yeah, that was a great way to kind of walk through that process, Ben. And I'll point out that depending on the investigation, it's kind of, because it's a co-created space, it's a bit of give and take. And so in the last one, we were working with a researcher, Dr. Miller. We kind of had the research question. We were filling in all the holes in terms of like, what data did we need? And for this one, we're all really working together. We don't have that question set out. So that's why we have kind of these buckets of themes that have arisen from the discussions. And now it needs to be continued back and forth to figure out the actual details. And so depending on how the rest of today goes and how the Wonder Board goes with you all, will kind of determine what direction we go, whether we need to take a vote on the topic, and then from there, think about the details, or if we do seem to be going in towards a topic and we can already vote on the details in terms of like what wording we need or what specific types of data we need. So like you mentioned, Nancy, for the arrival, like, are we going to focus on the birds that come in the morning and evening? And if we do, we have to make sure we're watching then. Or are we instead going to look at a pattern throughout the day, and maybe it doesn't matter as much that we get those exact times? And so it's a great point. The question is really going to determine how we collect the data, because they're very much connected.
And can you remind people one more time of the timeline, how much longer you expect the Wonder Board will be going and when a vote might be coming?
Yes, so hoping to have the Wonder Board going for about a week more. And as we prep to get the recording out to people and we talk on the Wonder Board, getting a vote out next week. And so depending on how discussion goes, whether we need to create a design board, which we've done in other investigations, which continues to help us narrow, or if we can stay on the Wonder Board, that'll be something we figure out over the next couple of days. But then next week, hoping to do a vote, because we want to start collecting data, and we know you do too. So that is the timeline we're hoping for, which some may argue is like, I just got here, like, can I contribute? You really can. You really, really can. Like, regardless of where you get to jump in, you have value in this.
Awesome. Thank you. And I think people are excited about the opportunity. And a few people have actually asked, they've come back to, well, why are you guys doing this cam? You guys have a lot of feeder cams, and this Wonder Board is just focused on this feeder cam. Why did you guys choose this one?
Well, number one, I think the Cornell Lab FeederWatch cam is really interesting because it is our most viewed camera. So a lot of people are sort of attracted to the setup and the camera, and they love watching the scenery there. So there's already a large audience that we can pull from and help us collect data throughout the data collection period on the live cam. Also, we're just interested in, based on the different seasons that we go through with our projects. Some cams might be more pertinent for a certain timeline than others. Right now, the Cornell Lab FeederWatch cam is bustling with all sorts of birds. There's a lot of activity. We're going to be looking for some spring migrants coming in soon to add to the diversity of the feeders. And we're also interested in comparing sort of the live annotation process on various different cameras. So we've already done a live investigation on our Panama fruit feeder cam, a live investigation during the nesting period on our Cornell Hawks cam. And we just want to see what that experience is like on a different cam that also has a really high viewership.
Great. Couple people have pointed out, this seems like it'd be a great opportunity for artificial intelligence or machine learning to also collect data. And I don't know if either of you have anything you want to share about that.
Sure, I'll just touch on that. There is definitely talk of that, and there are people at the lab that are thinking about those things. Right now, we're focusing on working with people in our community to collect the data, since they're already doing it on their own and they already want to investigate the things that they are interested in. And so I definitely think there's a place for AI, and there is a lot of talk of implementing that potentially with bird cams, potentially with cams in the world. And so that's kind of, I think, a next step. But BirdCam's lab right now is focusing on the community aspect of investigations together. So AI is definitely super, super cool. But for now, we'll focus on working together to collect the data.
I think another way to frame it is AI, artificial intelligence might be really good at maybe categorizing birds, but it may not be very good at developing interesting questions or analyzing results. And one of the goals of this whole project is to potentially provide new avenues for anybody, anywhere with a computer, really, to be able to engage in the scientific process and learn. And so, so while like machine learning probably has a role to play in pure data collection at this point, thankfully, our brains are better at generating questions and doing the rest of the scientific process right now.
Very true. Very true.
So we're getting through most of the BirdCam's lab questions, and what a flurry from everybody out there. We do have some other questions just about the feeder setup. We have about 7 minutes left, and I wonder if we could take the next couple minutes and just rifle through a few of them before hitting up the end. And we got a few questions, and I'll give you two big ones. Squirrels. Why don't we see more squirrels on the feeders? And related, what are you feeding the birds there? Because we get all these birds, we don't get starlings. That's a third part. Why don't you guys have starlings? You got starlings and squirrels. Why don't we have them? And what are you feeding them?
So I can take a stab at answering that, because I am the person that manages the feeder on a day-to-day basis. So I'm there on site every day, and I get to see what goes on around the feeder and help sort of keep the, work towards keeping the birds on the feeder and the rest of the squirrels and stuff off. Let me start by saying we do get squirrels, and we do get starlings. It's almost impossible to keep squirrels off of the feeder unless you have a feeder that is like a good at least 10 to 12 feet from any jumping platform. And while we do trimmings and stuff of the vegetation around the feeder, and we tried to place it in a really good spot that allows enough space away from jumping platforms, squirrels are very industrious creatures. They will get on the feeder if there is, any space available for them to. We also use baffles underneath our pole system that supports the feeder. That helps keep the squirrels from climbing up the feeders from underneath. And if anybody's interested at looking at a picture of the setup sort of from a different angle, you can email us at birdcams@cornell.edu, and I can send you a photo. So number one, baffles, providing enough distance away from any jumping platforms. They recommend 10 to 12 feet, but I would go even further if you have the opportunity to. I realize that not everybody has enough space to provide that much room for their bird feeder. I know that, in my backyard, I've had trouble with squirrels, even just dropping down from the treetops, mostly than anything else. But starlings, on the other hand, there are certain things you can do to keep starlings from visiting your feeders. It's not really an option for us because we have a big platform, and that's going to invite pretty much any type of species to come visit, including starlings. Now, some of the things you can do to sort of dissuade starlings from coming to your feeder is by using feeder types that aren't necessarily good for attracting starlings. So if you have a hanging feeder, for example, with a small perch and a small feeding port, starlings aren't going to be able to land on there and actually feed out of that small port. That's going to restrict larger birds from visiting. Starlings also really like suet, but they have a hard time accessing suet if it's an upside down suet feeder. So if you have a feeder that hangs down with the cage at the opening of the bottom, well, the suet's only open at the bottom. That will allow birds that are used to like hitching up tree trunks like nuthatches and woodpeckers to access it, but the starlings aren't nimble enough for that. So really it's a lot about how, thinking back and designing your bird feeder setup for the birds that you're most interested in attracting. It's not always going to work, but you can experiment with different things, offering different food types. A great resource that the lab has from our Project FeederWatch team is the Common Feeder Birds resource. Maybe we can get a link in the chat about that. Basically, it provides a great set of information about which food and feeder types are best to attract certain species. So if you're looking to attract certain species and not others, you can sort of use that resource to help inform you. I forget what the second question was about.
Is about what you're feeding there.
What
Maybe the
I'm feeding.
feeders, and we're at about 458.
Okay, so quickly, all of our food and feeders are supplied by our camp sponsor, Wild Birds Unlimited. In our feeder tray, we use their no mess, no millet blend, which is a mix of hulled sunflower, hulled peanut, hulled tree nuts. So it's a mix of that, doesn't have any shells, so that's why it's called no mess, because the birds can eat everything. We also offer suet. We have some shelled peanuts in a feeder right now. We also have some different seed characters that are made up of different things like safflower and other seeds, but we switch out arrangements throughout the year. And we just try to mix things up to provide a lot of opportunity for a good diversity of birds. So if you want to check out that resource, that'll help you out from FeederWatch.
So we're barreling on to the very end of this thing. Thanks everyone for sticking around. Still about a couple hundred people online here. And I thought we'd take it out. There's a couple questions here that I think are worth asking or answering before we head off. And one of them was, how do I actually find the most recent stuff on the Wonder Board so that I'm not duplicating? Which if you might give a quick, I think there's a button there, right? You can sort by most recent. Is that right?
Yeah, so on the Wonder Board, if you look at the top right above where it says join discussion, on the right-hand side, you can sort by best, you can sort by newest, or you can sort by oldest. And so you can see kind of new, old, or your favorites. And so that's how I would recommend doing that.
And then yeah, I saw that you answered this question typing, Rachel, but I thought it'd be a great question to take us out on as well, which is, do we have a role to play after the data collection stage is complete? And I thought that's a great way to sort of give a little bit more context to what BirdCam's lab is.
Definitely. Yeah. So we're coming right up on the hour, and that question is really at the crux of what BirdCam's lab is and why it's so cool, in my opinion, is that you don't just get to collect data with us if you want to. You get to be a part of the entire scientific process. So you can help us ask the research question, or you can help us share it at the end, or you can jump in anywhere in between. You can collect data, you can visualize it with us. We want you to be a part of it the whole way, because we found, especially through the past couple of years, that the community, whether it's professional or non-professional scientists, we all have really interesting ideas and really interesting interpretations. So we invite everyone to continue on with us along the way, and we communicate primarily through email and social media. So you can always stay tuned on the latest BirdCam's lab. And with that, I'll put up our closing screen here so that you can make sure to sign up. If you are interested and you're not already part of our email list, sign up here at that first link, and then make sure you follow us on Twitter if you're there as well. But you don't have to have social media at all to be a part of this. We do stay up to date with everyone via email pretty consistently. And then if you have questions after this or anytime in the future, you know where to find us, birdcams@cornell.edu.
Thanks for joining, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, very curious group. It's great talking with you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much for being a part of this.